We know the policy is a failure. And I mean, these particular details are not known to everybody, but everybody knows that the policy has been a failure. Gallup polls, Pew Research Institute, question gets asked in many different ways. Give our drug policy a grade. It gets a grade of D or F. How many of you think it's succeeding? 10% say succeeding and 75% say not succeeding. These kinds of numbers consistently year after year. Policy continues. Why does the policy continue? Why does a policy that is failing continue? Something to think about is that as this policy continues, the number of people who die from the use of illegal drugs has more than tripled since 1980. Since I started working for this in the Congress in 1980, the death rate has more than tripled. Now you would think, if you said, what's the first goal of your drug policy? Your first goal would be to save lives. That would be goal number one. And you would manipulate whatever you were doing towards saving lives. And yet, that's not what's happening. The injuries have gone up steadily, so that more and more people are showing up at hospital emergency rooms from the use of drugs. Again, an evidence of failure. And of the economic side, the traffickers are becoming more efficient. So why does a failed policy continue? What's its power over the culture? It's not simply the bureaucrats. It plays a very important, that is, drug prohibition, quote, the war on drugs, the drug problem, plays a very, very deep role in our culture. What do you think that role is?
To establish the hegemony.
Well, it basically establishes who is a social outcast, because it establishes, what is socially acceptable to put in your body and what isn't.
Establishes who is a social outcast. And the thing to recognize, it is much bigger than simply the forbidden chemicals. It's not just contaminated craniums. Because the drug problem is actually a synonym for race in our culture. The drug problem has been transformed. In 1973, Al Blumstein at Carnegie Mellon wrote a very important paper called A Theory of the Stability of Punishment. He looked at the rate of incarceration from 1920 to 1970 and found that it was relatively flat at about 110 per 100,000. And so he looks at this and he says, gee, this is amazing. Alcohol prohibition, the Depression, World War II, the post-war boom, the 50s, the 60s, the rate of incarceration remains relatively flat at about 110 per 100,000. He looks at Norway, finds similar kinds of data in Norway, that the rate of incarceration is level. Publishes a paper, A Theory of the Stability of Punishment. Now, Blumstein, past president of the American Society of Criminology, one of the you Google him, you'll find him quoted all the time. And so I would go see him present at conferences. He was an expert on this rate of incarceration thing. And so he'd put up a slide, sort of show this flat thing. And then he'd sort of extend it, sort of the rest of the slide, bring us up to date. And the rate of incarceration now looks like this. And you'd see this and you'd say, how remarkable. What's happened here? Why is there this change? What is the historical, what's going on? We're talking about, deep, deep historical kinds of culture here. There's a lot of stuff happens in this half century. And it suddenly changes dramatically. And here's what I thought. This point, from about maybe 55 to 70, is the civil rights movement. This is the bloody struggle for civil rights for African Americans in American society. And by the end of the 60s, you could no longer segregate. You could no longer stigmatize people. You couldn't say, blacks, you can't live here. Blacks, you can't ride the bus. You can't eat in my restaurant. You can't sit in the back. You can't sit in this classroom. You can't swim in this pool. You can't belong to this club. We broke down what had been centuries of segregation. What's missing in this is the punishment for the status of being black in a white majority society, a status which is segregated. It was like being on parole today. It's like being on parole. You can't associate with these people. You can't travel here without permission. You can't live there. You can't do all these kinds of things. To be black in America prior to the Civil Rights Movement was like being on parole. They were being punished all the time for the status, for being deviants in a white majority society. Well, that white majority society didn't just give up. They bombed churches. They assassinated civil rights leaders. They protested. They killed. They filibustered. They didn't give up. And the social pressure to maintain white privilege didn't eliminate when the civil rights movement won. So what happens here? Well, there's the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. You have Richard Nixon's campaign on a law and order platform in 1968. The association becomes created between drugs and blacks. So drugs are an urban problem. And so when we think about racial profiling is not a deviance in law enforcement behavior, it's the expected law enforcement behavior. Because during this period, who enforced the segregation laws? If the black kid had the temerity to go into the whites-only swimming pool, who came? The local police. How were all of the race codes enforced? By the local police. So it's now the son, the nephew, the grandson of the cops who enforced those laws who are today the police commanders and law enforcement officers today. White high school kids today use cocaine at a rate that is 3 times the rate that African American kids use cocaine. When I tell this to the Rotary Club or other groups that I speak to, largely white, they're shocked. They can't believe it. Because hard drugs like cocaine, that's a black drug. White people, that's not, the drug problem is a black problem. If I say, like the slave Cleveland, today we're going to talk about the problem of youth at risk. Okay, youth at risk. And what is in your thought balloon, in the image of, I want you to visualize a youth at risk. What is the skin color of the youth at risk that pops into your mind? Is it a kid who looks like you? Is it a kid in college? Or is it a black kid in the city? So that the very terminology is not explicitly racial, it carries racial messages. And that the power of the war on drugs is to maintain white privilege. That's its role in American society. So that if I am a white businessman and someone comes to me and applies for a job, and it's a person of color, well, I guess I have to do more of a background check on them, I guess. I probably have to require a drug test. But if I get a young white person who comes in, well, they're not immediately associated with, if they're all clean cut, they've been on the XYZ club, they didn't put SSDP on their resume, and so I don't have to make assumptions. I don't make assumptions. I don't make assumptions about their criminal deviance. I don't make presumptions about their criminal deviance. So that part of what we are working to struggle with is a system that is